Great.
Thank you, Christina. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, can we see that? You can see some slides. Awesome. Um, and I just want to make sure that I can see the chat, so just give me a second. All right. Um, so now you know how it is working from multiple monitors where you try to look at the camera, but you're not always looking at the camera. So I swear I'm focused on you folks. I swear. Um, so welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I don't know what time it is for you, so happy, day. Happy Monday. For me, it's relatively early for me still. So we are going to talk about something called systems thinking and this particular tool called the iceberg model. So if you don't know anything about systems thinking, I have that covered. If you do know stuff about systems thinking, then I won't cover it. So we will do what we need to do. I think we're a pretty small group. So what I may do is we may just keep everyone together instead of doing a breakout room, and see if we can get some crowdsourcing happening. So, all right. So I am in Canada, and in Canada, one of the things that we try to do is a land acknowledgement at the start of things. And to me, this is a really important thing, not just to like, look, I'm on Treaty 6, but to actually, do things about the land acknowledgement and in terms of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So I am on Treaty 6, which is it crosses from about middle of Alberta into middle of Saskatchewan. And there's two different dates on the map for when Treaty 6 was created. So basically there was a section that was added a little bit later on. And so it's the traditional homes of the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakiska, and a few other groups. It's also traditional or home of Métis, and they just changed things, so they're no longer a region. It's the Métis government. Um, so what I have on the screen is an image of Canada. It's a map of Canada, and it shows the different numbered treaties. So we have different types of treaties in Canada. So these are all the numbered ones. And I know it works for North America. I don't know if it works in other parts of the world, but if you're curious about what land, whose land you are on, nativeland.ca lets you check whose land you are on. So the other one that I thought I might do a quick little thing about is what is actually sustainability, because I know from my students that lots of people come in and they're like, sustainability is reusable straws. Um, and they all confess at the end of the first course that they take that they came in thinking that they were going to learn maybe about climate change and about doing things like, not taking plastic bags at the store or things like that. And they quickly realize in the course that it is much bigger than that. And so I teach systems thinking and sustainability. So this is the model of sustainability. It's an image of the model of sustainability that my university established a number of years ago. So it is four interconnecting circles. The circles are economic health, environmental responsibility, cultural vitality, and social equity. And in the center, the thing that all of those things have to come together to create is well-being. And I think that this is a really important part of how I take up sustainability and why equity is so important to me is that I have seen way too many people where they're like, well, you have to eat a 100-mile diet. So you can only eat food from within 100 miles. Cool, but if you're an immigrant, does that mean you never get to eat food from home? Because that isn't grown here. That's clearly problematic. If, the message is, well, you should all buy electric cars. Cool. If I can't afford to put food on my table, I'm probably not gonna buy an electric car. So it really is connected. And so I came to equity, which obviously MYFest is very much about through sustainability. And so this is kind of part of my origins. But I also think that they're really important to connect together, because often um, there are massive inequities in terms of, where industrial sites are located is often closer to already marginalized populations. There's been actually some really horrendous things happened where national parks, Banff was our first national park. It is in my province. And they kicked the Nakota out in order to create that national park. So it's all connected, which is also where I get to systems thinking. All right. So this relates to the iceberg, and we're going to come back to this. So we'll talk a little bit about systems thinking. But one of my big turning points as an educator, so I just have like an icon type graphic on the screen of somebody talking and somebody listening. And it was my first year of teaching, and I got brought in. It was in post-secondary. I got brought in to teach a particular class because of my sustainability background. And, you teach the class that was given to you the first time, and there was a paper in it, but I never taught them how to write papers. And a student said, I think you're biased towards good writers, when they got their mark. And I looked at them and I said, so is the system. And it was this really interesting exchange with this student that really made me start to question what this bias was and whether it was appropriate or not. So that was my event, and we'll come back to my event in a little bit. So I want you to take a minute, and you can share in the chat or you can unmute because we are a pretty small group. Or you can keep it to yourself as well, of course. But what is an event that was a turning point for you in how you think about equity and sustainability in teaching? It's always the uncomfortable, like, how long do you wait? Um, I had a student, I just need to. So Jenny says, I had a student come to me in tears because he was failing my course. He had gotten behind due to circumstances outside of his control, and you didn't have a way for him to get back on track. Yep.
I'm happy to share if or it is that all right?
Yeah,
Um
for sure. Thank you, Hannah.
I've been thinking about this for ages, and so it's hard to think like what the turning point was, but there was definitely a point for me, I don't know about anyone else, but I always have like revolutionary thoughts in the bath or the shower. They are the place for revolutionary thoughts. And in 2011, I had come back from maternity leave, and I was working, and I don't know, a whole load of things sort of coalesced in a week, where my students were having all sorts of different problems to do with sort of equity and to do with their sort of disabilities. And my I'm so I teach archaeology, and I'd been reading all this amazing work by this archaeologist who, in like 1985, she'd critiqued how in archaeology women do like sort of archaeological housework, where they all do the lab work and they do that. And I know that this is actually something that is applicable to other subjects as well. But so women sort of tend to do the lab work and the things that are sort of almost a bit behind the scenes, and all the men run the big projects and appear on TV and so on. And I was thinking about, that was in 1985, and I was like, oh my gosh. And here I am, and at the time I was a technician in archaeology, but I was also teaching. I was like, I'm exactly the same. So in order to be able to have children and things, I'm falling into that, doing the archaeology housework role. So I'm behind the scenes, and all my students are having all these problems. And my subject area, it's got all these awful equity problems which compound all these issues that students are having. And all of it sort of came to me in a moment in the bath, and then I was like, oh my gosh, got to sort this out. Something's got to happen. So I think that was like sort of, it was a real pinpointable moment for me. So there you go. That's probably far too much information. So, there you are.
No, I love it. I love it. And I think, you raise so many points in there about, it's generally not a moment. It's the moment that's like, oh, everything just came together moment. And I think that that's really key. So we have a few more in the chat here. So Anna says, pandemic teaching, really realizing how difficult the circumstances of many students were. Yeah, yeah. Um, I had students who were having to do their classes from their cars outside the institution so that they could use the Wi-Fi from the institution because they couldn't afford the Wi-Fi. Um, Tim says, I work with final year undergraduate students and started thinking a lot about the world into which they would graduate. Yep, and what roles they could play in making it more sustainable and just. And what a world we're in right now. There's a lot. Um, Christina, I was teaching a philosophy course and a student was struggling with the archaic translation of the text. It was an open access version and the translation was so old, it was out of copyright. It was free of cost, so that was good, but realized that the language was such a barrier that people were not able to get the main ideas. Yeah. I think, and that's that balancing of different equity considerations, right? Is so difficult. Rachel, for me, it was when I was a student myself and an instructor told me I wasn't trying hard enough. In reality, you were in cancer treatment and was doing your absolute best. All work was getting done, just not in the rigid timeline the teacher expected. That's when you fully experience what it's like to be trapped in the academic cycle of inequity. So first of all, I'm really glad that you're here and the cancer treatment was hopefully successful. And I think, I always say I don't know what your reality is. Um, and so I try, really hard with students to be really accommodating. There's sometimes when it's like, can I submit every assignment 2 days after the semester ended? Um, no. But not recognizing you don't know everything about what's going on for people, I think is so important. Doreen was facilitating a session on hygiene for girls, which included demonstration how to use the hygiene items. One girl was visually impaired, and you hadn't anticipated how to have her interact with the item as well. Yeah, it was challenging to say the least. Um, so I coach Dragon Boat, and it's in my head because I was just at a competition all weekend. But I have a visually impaired paddler on my team. And it's interesting how often I catch myself where I'm like, and you're gonna, do this. And I'm just miming it and I'm showing them what they need to do. And I'm like, uh, uh, frame, rejig this, because she has a wonderful friend on the boat who I will hear start to pipe up with the explanation. And I'm like, no, that is my job. I need to do that. But the challenge of, not always anticipating that, I think is so challenging. So thank you, for sharing. I want you to keep those in your heads. And I'm sure we could all come up with a number of different events that we've had that we've seen. And if you work in faculty development, you may have seen it for other people as well, or even with colleagues. And, what do you do with that is kind of the next thing. So what I'm hoping to give you today, so this is kind of my agenda, is an introduction to systems thinking if it's needed. If you're all experts in systems thinking, then we'll keep going. We're going to practice using the iceberg model. So I'm going to explain what it is, and we're going to go through some examples. And then looking at how do we actually find meaningful leverage points. So I went to one of the sessions that Maha and Mia were running on Friday, and they used TRIZ, which is one of the liberatory structures. And it was funny because I was like, oh, I do that, but I've never called it TRIZ. I just do that. We're going to use TRIZ unintentionally because I really like it as an approach to use, but didn't know that that's what people were calling it. So, okay. So type in the chat, use a reaction. How confident would you be if somebody said, what is systems thinking? How confident would you be in answering that question? Rachel says pretty confident. Okay. A bit confident. Okay. Not very. All right. Not very. A bit. No, note in the context of archaeology. Yeah, that's fair, Hannah. Systems thinking is actually really interesting because it kind of emerged from a lot of different spaces in all the same time span. So it's kind of an interesting piece of it. Rachel, I love it. I enjoy hearing what it is again, though. So one of the classes I teach is actually an entire semester on systems thinking. I am currently working on building an open education resource on it, so there will eventually be a textbook. Because I looked through a lot of different resources. And because it did emerge from a lot of different fields, there's a lot of different versions out there. And I think for like the introduction piece, I like kind of, pulling what are the common themes from systems thinking in different spaces. So we're not gonna like systems thinking. I mean, you could do an entire excellent. Okay. Rachel, I'll give you my email so you can connect with me because yeah. And if you're really familiar too, I will need reviewers of it. Um but so I kind of like pulling, all from all the definitions that are out there, what are the key characteristics? And so this is kind of my decision. So this is from I have an intro textbook on sustainability that is already out there in the world as an OER. And so you're thinking about the whole. You have to have multiple perspectives. And we're thinking about the whole, but one of the key things in systems thinking is that it's relationships. So if we often contrast systems thinking with reductionism, and reductionism is I can break it down into the pieces and I can understand the whole from just looking at the individual pieces. Systems thinking says, nope, there are relationships between all the parts that create new properties of the system. So they're called emergent properties. And they are properties that you can't pin down to any particular thing. And social equity is an emergent property because it arises from how our education system interacts, how our economic systems interact, how our employment works, how use planning works. And so you can't pinpoint inequity to a single thing. It's arising from the whole system and how it interacts with each other. And so that's one of the key things about systems thinking. Another really important part of systems thinking is mental models. So we all have, and we'll talk a bit more about mental models because they're really key in the iceberg, but we all have these mental models. So we see them in things like our language. So Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about what happens when we call nature it. So if I call a tree an it, then it changes my relationship with that tree and it lets me do things to that tree that I wouldn't do to another being if I considered it a being. And so she has some talks and some writing about the use of kin to describe non-human relatives. And so what would it be instead of saying, oh, that tree over there is, a spruce tree, it is 30 years old. What if I said that tree over there is a spruce tree, my kin is 30 years old? And how does that change our relationship? And that starts with our mental models. And so our language is often one of the best places to find what your mental models are. And sometimes we hold different mental models than what our language lets us communicate. So systems thinking looks at those mental models and goes, okay, how are they creating the system? So there's a quote from Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance about if you tear down the factory and rebuild it, but you don't change any of the systems, then you're just going to rebuild the same factory. And we see that all the time, right? Governments change. We often just rebuild the same problems because we haven't changed the mental models. And systems thinking also is considering the long term. So really important that we're not just thinking about tomorrow or even 5 years from now. It's the long-term plan. Does anybody either have questions or anything that they want to add about what they think about systems thinking? And you can do that in the chat, or again, you can unmute.
I just quickly ask, this is just a nerdy question, but so the bit about mapping relationships, it sounds very much like this comes from sort of relational thinking. Is that right? I think the system thinking that I'm familiar with comes from something from the 70s, and this sounds much more like it's situated in a context of like relationality, of maybe like sort of thinking like a bit assemblage thinking, that kind of thing. Is that where
Yes.
this comes
So
from?
there are kind of two paths in systems thinking. There's hard systems thinking, which definitely has a bit more of the Western approaches, the reductionism in it. And then there's soft systems thinking. But part of it is that systems thinking arose in computer science, ecology, and business, um, all kind of at the same time. And so um and this again is where I've kind of gone through and gone like, okay, what are the common themes? I definitely am more on the soft systems thinking side, which looks at you really don't have these systems without some sort of social context around it. And therefore, the relations are really, really important within it. Does that help?
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments or things you want to add before we move on? Um, and of course, if something comes up for you as we're going, please do ask as we go. The ADHD lets me pay a lot attention to a lot of things at the same time. Um, um, So I really like this quote. Again, this is part of my, actioning, doing more than a land acknowledgement. I've spent a lot of time in writing this OER for systems thinking and looking at Indigenous perspectives. And Melanie, a good child, is a systems theorist, and she is Indigenous, and she has this quote in one of her papers. So, systems thinking is, in fact, a very old, ancient, and wise way of thinking that has been protected and nurtured by Indigenous peoples despite cultural genocide and assimilationist policies that forbade speaking the very languages that encode our complexity pattern of thinking and systems awareness. And she has a lovely article. I don't remember if it was this one or if it was like, there's kind of a part one and a part two, and I don't remember which one this was. But in part one, it's this fascinating article, and the structure is quite different. That she had conversations with leaders in Western systems thinking and with Indigenous elders. And she actually ended up writing the article as a two-column article as a nod to the two-row wampum belt, which was part of how many Indigenous people actually understood treaties were supposed to be. Is the idea that you have these separate paths, but they're traveling, through the same space, and there's this space in between that you interact in. And she talks about, we need that interaction space between Western and Indigenous systems thinking. Um, and language, she brings up language. And so many Indigenous languages are verb-based. And so it's not a tree, it's treeing. It's not a table, it's tabling. And there's some really interesting resources on this, and I'm happy to share things um, at the end as much as I can, pull up links and stuff. But um, it's very different to think about how, thank you, Jenny, how our relationships with things would change if we're thinking of them not as an object, but as something that is doing. And again, thinking about that spruce tree that I can see out my window, it is treeing. So, how does that change again my relationship with that tree? And what does treeing mean for me? What does treeing mean for the tree? It's kind of an interesting thing to start thinking about. So I always want to pay homage because I think a lot of times in Western ways of knowing, we go, oh, we have this great concept and it's so brilliant and everybody should follow it. When really there's, many populations out there, many cultures out there going, um, so we've actually been doing that. Um, maybe you shouldn't have tried to destroy us. And I think that that's, really important when we're talking about something like systems thinking. So I talk about it as systems thinking because I am a white settler on this land. But I think it's really important to recognize that there is this, cultural aspect and indigenous precedent. Okay. Oh, thank you for getting the quote, Hannah. That was awesome. So the iceberg model. So the iceberg in systems thinking, there's a number of different tools. Um, there's lots of really, really helpful tools. I have students, they decide on a wicked problem at the start of the semester that they're interested in. So this past semester, I had students doing sex trafficking, homelessness, opioid crisis, um, alcohol addiction, digital addiction, privacy versus security. So they get to choose something that they're interested in. Overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. They do not choose light topics. Um, I have to take care of my mental health while marking their assignments. And in their final reflections, a number of them said, I chose this topic because I'm interested, but I kind of thought I knew everything about it, so it would make the assignments really easy. I was wrong. And they started to unpack how complex these issues actually are. And a lot of them confessed that at the end, they were like, I now see why we're having such a hard time in solving these. And that's kind of why I thought that this was a good space for talking about the iceberg model, is I think that a lot of us are facing education systems that are really frustrating and it's overwhelming and it's like, why can't I just make this better? And so to get at some of the depth of why it's not changing, even when on the surface, we might do certain things that seem like it would change. So the iceberg model helps us to uncover the structures and the mental models that are creating the events and the patterns that we see. So there are 4 levels. We've already talked about the event level. One of the hardest things people have with the iceberg model is actually deciding like this is an event, because an event is very specific, right? It's something that I can point to and describe. But lots of times when people are working with the model, they're like, oh, it's this pattern of, and I'm like, nope, that's a pattern. What's the event? For the individual who was doing the in overrepresentation of Indigenous in the criminal justice system, looking at a specific trial and what the outcome of that trial was. That is an event. And then the pattern, so then they can take that pattern and go, oh, this pattern is this Indigenous individual was sentenced to X number of years in prison. And then they can look at the pattern and go, oh, Indigenous people on average are sentenced to more time in prison than white individuals are. Um, and so it helps you kind of to go like, okay, this is a very specific event. And then you can start to track the patterns. Then the structures are what's creating the patterns, and this is where our relationships start to come in. So it is things like the legal rules. So what is the rules setup of the system? And we can say the same thing about education. What are the rules of the education system? What are funding models? How does what are all the different structures that are leading to these patterns? And then underneath the structures, we have the mental models. And these are the values, beliefs, and assumptions that are shaping the system because they're what's shaping those rules that we're creating, right? So my grammar example, and we'll look at this as an example right away here. But my student saying, "Oh, you're biased towards good writers." Well, there's a mental model of what a good writer looks like, and it's very colonial English in where I am. And so, that leads to certain repercussions in how the system ends up being set up. Okay, so we're going to go through my event. I'm going to get some participation in here when we get to structures and mental models. But the event was, student tells me that I'm biased towards good writers. I say, so is the system. We did have more of a conversation after that. I didn't just leave it at that, I promise. Um, but so that's my event. An event tends to be a pretty short description for the most part. Sometimes they are longer, but So pattern, so that interaction made me go, huh, I remember, my PhD supervisor saying to me, "Oh, what I love about working with you, Tai, is that I don't have to comment on your writing, so we can also actually talk about ideas." And I remember thinking to myself, like, so you're not talking about the ideas that like that student's doing? Like, huh? And I remember having that moment, and I remember, certain things in my own student experience of I actually got critiqued in my science classes that I was told to be less flowery with my science writing. And here's the best part about it, the word that they circled was therefore. They circled therefore and drew an arrow and said, "Don't be so flowery in your scientific writing." Um, and it was interesting because it wasn't until much later that I was having a conversation with my husband and we were talking about bias against women in science. And my husband went, "Do you think that the prof would have circled therefore and said, 'Don't be as flowery' if you had been a male student?" And it was like, oh, oh. So, I started to clue in of like, oh, there's this pattern. And then I realized how much it carries over into how we mark. So, how many rubrics do you see where grammar in a non-grammar related course counts for? And I mean, I used to work as an ed developer and an instructional designer, and I would see rubrics in certain subjects where 25% of their grade was based on grammar. And I'm like, do you teach them this? Well, no, they should just have it from their background. Okay. All right. Um, and I've had, now I've had a number of students that I've interacted with in, as I've evolved and changed, um, who have commented that as English language learners, they love the fact that my grading structure means that if they didn't communicate their point clearly, they get feedback and they get a chance to revise it. So I'm not taking the marks off because their grammar wasn't there. I'm going, "I don't actually understand what you're saying. Can we have a conversation? Can you help me understand it?" And they've commented to me now how much that has changed. So there's this pattern of how we assess language, or how language gets included in your mark on every other topic, more precisely. And so, you may have really great understanding of biology or archaeology, um, but if you're not writing it clearly, then it does often impact how you do in those classes because it's hard to communicate within these frameworks. I also think in terms of AI, Grammarly is pretty common these days in North America at least. But what grammar is it correcting you to? And so it has a bias in it. Okay, structures. So what structures are you seeing in this iceberg that we're unpacking of how I interacted with this student in our conversation? And again, chat or uh, unmute. Yeah, very nicely put, Tim. Fluency in language is a proxy for intellect ability. Any other structures that you're seeing? There's one set right way to express yourself in academia. Yeah, Rachel. And again, going back to some of the indigenous, it has to be written too, right? Um, so I know there's more and more resources out there on how to cite oral knowledge. So we are trying to change. Is it actually changing? Yeah, basic structure. Assessment needs to distinguish and rank candidates. So I use alternative grading, and I have students from all across the institution take my classes. But this spring semester, half my class were nursing students. I don't know if it's like this in other locations, but nursing students in, at least at my institution, tend to be very high achieving individuals. So they all did extra on every assignment, and I had a lot of A pluses. I'm like, okay, sending this to my dean, who doesn't even like to give an A to a student, going, are you going to approve my grades or not? Because have I ranked them enough? We also have the societal standards. A lot of us do code switching. So we change how we speak or write depending on our audience. But some people, they have to code switch in order to be perceived as intelligent, right? Um, and so I had a student once who did a spoken word poem as his assignment. And it took me a while to unpack what he had said because I didn't speak in that dialect. But it was such a brilliant assignment. It was so well done, right? And there's certain things that we accept, like, oh, you can do poetry in these styles. Oh, if you want to write me a sonnet in this, Shakespearean sonnet about this, then go you. But you want to write me a rap about it? Mm, right? So there's ones that we'll take and ones that we won't. Getting into a top university versus starting at community college or regional state university. Yep. So, I mean, we could just keep talking about structures, to be honest. Because the more you start to think about them, the more we look at, the economic system plays a role because how does it affect what jobs you get? Um, so all of the systems are interacting with each other. Um, but we have a level deeper to go to. So the mental models. So thinking about the structures that we've talked about, what are some of the mental models that are creating those structures? Some people just aren't capable of learning. Yep. Um, if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, there's a great article from Benjamin Bloom from 1968, where he talks about what competency is, and he actually critiques education very heavily and says that, in any other field, if an advertiser puts out an ad and it fails, they go, "Ooh, what was wrong with our ad?" But in education, so many educators do a lesson and they're like, Cool, the right number of people failed my test. And I've actually heard that said by professors at my institution. I knew it was a good test because about 30% of the students failed. Like, what? Um, there is one thing called linguistic fluency, and it is best identified with formal academic writing. Yeah, yeah. The normative Western ways of thinking that about what are right ways to communicate and to be an academic. Yeah. And the thing is that we recognize most students in post-secondary aren't going to become academics either. And yet, for the most part, we're still asking them to write in this very academic style. So it's also this hierarchy. And I've seen that in a few of the structures that you said, that some people are just better than others. And we're going to be able to determine that by their grades and how they write. And that will, of course, lead them on to being better contributors to the economy, right? So when you start to get to the mental models, it's a little bit defeating sometimes, admittedly. Um, because it's like, oh, how do I change that? How do I change the way somebody thinks? So highly recommend the book Think Again by Adam Grant. Um, it's great because it's about being able to think again yourself and rethink your own perspectives. But then he also has really, really great tips on how to have conversations with others because you're not going to change their mind. So, how do you have conversations with others that maybe helps them to see conflicts in their mental models? Because that's the thing is we can also hold two conflicting mental models, right? And we see that unfortunately again all the time in racism. Like my parents are very liberal people and they're very welcoming and inclusive. And yet some of the things that come out of their mouths are very racist. And they're holding these two beliefs side by side without realizing that they're conflicting. And until somebody has a conversation with them. And I love seeing the light bulb moment for people when they're like, oh, that does conflict with my belief about this. So this is part of the challenge is it's very hard to change mental models. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend this is why I asked for the hour and 15 minutes because I was like these are tough things to also get into. So what I want you to do is think about the event that you started with. We're not going to go into breakout rooms because there's not very many of us. So I want you to think about either the event that you shared at the beginning or a recent event that something got in the way of the equitable or sustainable future you envision. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. And you can, again, share it in the chat or you can keep it to yourself and work through it. And we'll share some actions a little bit later on. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah. I know it's always risky scheduling something more than an hour, but also I hate like not doing justice and rushing through things. So once you have your event in mind, I want you to think, you're probably going to guess the next step. What are the patterns that the event is part of? So Anna says my grant for STEM scholarships for underrepresented students in STEM getting canceled and then reinstated with explicit instructions to avoid any DEI. Yep. Yep. I feel like there's a lot of times right now that we just have to like sit with that moment of like, whew. I've said this a few times to my students that like I would love to be able to respond to all of the tough things, but sometimes there just isn't a response, and responding directly and immediately actually reduces the severity of the challenge. Okay, so patterns. What are the structures that are creating that pattern? So Rachel put in the chat, sharing this rubric from an ED course she's enrolled in. I received this grade on discussion posts, which I put a lot of work into. Instead of seeing the thoughts, they focused on correct citation formats. Yeah, I've seen that a few times. There's at another university in my city, there's an education course on alternative assessment where they assess the students with multiple choice exams. We're going to spend all semester talking about this. Yeah. And so then Rachel has posted the rubric. Um, so getting novice posts that ramble and are disorganized, information contained in the post is off topic, not um, I don't want to read the whole thing, but I think this is the thing, right? Is I for the most part I use marking guides instead of rubrics. Um, and part of that is from the alternative grading that I do, but so often I just found that the rubric wouldn't actually let me say what I needed to say about the student. Like, and it doesn't let you respond to, what's going on in what's happening for that student. I yeah. Yep. Um, okay. So before we get to mental models, take a minute with the structures. What are the things that you are currently doing that helps to maintain those structures? So this is the Triz part, is how do we do this wrong? What are we currently doing that isn't working? And as I can see people thinking, I'm going to say sometimes this is really emotional too, because you're like, crap. I thought I was doing really well. I thought I was doing all these things. And here's how I'm actually contributing to making the system the way it is that I hate or that I don't think is fair. So do take a moment. And if you need to, give yourself a break, give yourself that permission slip to feel, please do that because it can be really tough. right? My moment with that student of realizing how many students I had potentially penalized because I just assumed that good writing was part of what I should be marking. Every time I change my grading structures, I'm like, I'm sorry to every student before. So I do want to get to the like positive space. Um, so how do we change structures? So again, systems thinking, there's lots of people who talk about this. I tried to pull kind of the common threads again. So feedback loops are a really big thing in systems thinking. We look for balancing and reinforcing feedback loops. Um, so balancing loop maintains the status quo. It maintains things around a target goal. Sometimes it's not the target we actually want it to be. Sometimes it's the target the system sets most of the time. And reinforcing are ones that just, whatever happens makes that happen again. So interest on money in the bank, the more money you have in the bank, the more interest you get, which means the more money you have in the bank, which means the more interest you get. Um, so that's, a pretty classic reinforcing loop. You can also get them going down. So we see that with climate change and the loss of ice in the Arctic, that, the hotter the temperature is, the less ice we have, which then increases or decreases the albedo, which means that we melt more ice and the temperature gets hotter. Um, Reinforcing goals. So this happens a lot, and DEI has come up. So how many of you can point to things in your system that we say this is our goal? And you can probably look through and go, here are all the ways that we are not actually reinforcing that goal. The goal is really good, but we're not actually taking the actions. The funding structures don't contribute to that goal. Hunger is a really good one. So food insecurity. Our goal is that nobody is food insecure, but then our policies about things like minimum wage and housing costs and all of these features contribute to making food or insecurity the reality. So we have a stated goal, but we're not actually working towards that goal. So developing the incentives, the authority structures, and funding streams that will actually support that goal can contribute to changing the structure. And sometimes we need to change the goal. So we generally aim for what we measure. So um, uh, Kelly Hogan and VG Sathi do a lot of equity-based work in education. And Kelly Hogan did a study on her biology class. And she was like, yeah, like, my students are all being successful. I'm getting this really high, passing average. This is good. And then she got the racial breakdown of her class and realized that Black students were 9 times more likely to fail the class. So looking at the numbers overall was great. Looking at the numbers very specifically, it was not. So she was measuring this overall goal and had to change the goal and changed how she taught as a result, which boosted the success of all students, but particularly those that were struggling before. So sometimes we do need to change the goal. Changing the goal on our own can be really challenging. But again, we have these conversations. Lots of times these are things that we want to be talking about. Obviously, the political system in many areas of the world, not just the US. The US just might be the most prominent example at the moment. Can sometimes undermine the goals that we might have. But so those are the 3 main ways that we're going to change structures. So take your list of things that you're doing that contribute to those structures that you don't think are helping. And can you identify a space that has an action that you can take? So if you think of an action that you're willing to share, please consider putting it into the chat. We're getting close to the end of time here. But one, you might inspire somebody else's action. But two, there's also something about, I've said this publicly. So in my own example, one of the actions that I did was that, I changed my own approach. But when I was working as an instructional designer and as and developer, I also talked to people a lot about their rubrics and what should actually be included in their rubric based on what the learning outcomes for that course were. Um, and what their options were in terms of making sure that that student could still communicate their understanding, but in ways that maybe worked better for them. That's okay, Tim. Everything starts with tiny things, I think. So Tim says, start asking students questions like what matters to you in whatever you pursue after graduation, rather than what are you planning to do after graduation. I like that. I don't think it's tiny, to be honest. Um, I'm gonna put the link to my current um, OER in the chat here. And the reason I'm doing that is that in chapters 4 and 5, I have some activities, some reflection activities that the students do. And they're asking some of those deeper questions. Um, and the transformation that students go through in that class it blows my mind every single semester. Um, Hannah says the event you're reflecting on is a response you received from your department about an analysis of our department awarding gaps. Their responses highlighted structural inequities, and you realize that you are not doing enough to call that out in a productive way. So that's the action you need to take. Yeah. My university is currently having me, they're trying to prevent me from putting a prereq onto a third year course. And I'm like, but students aren't being successful if they don't have some experience. And I said, if we actually value student success like we say we do in the strategic plan, then we need to set the courses up so that students can be successful. Um, without requiring me to meet for 5 hours a week with these students outside of class time. Um, And so I have made the argument and I gave them an option. I said, I will take this or this as the prereq. And so they have agreed to my, you can do one or the other as a prereq, and I figure I'll try it for a couple semesters, and if it still isn't working, then I'll change it again. But how do we push back? So thank you for sharing. I hope um, the others have come up with some ideas. And if you haven't, again, as Hannah said, showers are great places to have brainwaves of wisdom. I do a lot while I'm, doing something completely unrelated. Walking the dogs is great. Um, just in our last couple minutes, changing mental models, they are the hardest to change. But what's really key is we have examples. And so lots of times I hear from students, oh, it's just human nature, but it's not. And keeping that in mind, I think is a really powerful thing. So, you know, Earth is the center of the universe. Nope. We know that now. It took a lot of time to change that, though. Seatbelts in cars. Um, AI. AI is changing our mental model, you know, as we speak. We also see different mental models in different cultures or communities. And a dominant leader can contribute, but it does take the system and the community to go along with it. So I wanted to share this just as kind of a final note. So there's this book, it is sitting on my desk. So this is what the cover looks like. It is uh, the title is down here. I apologize. I do not know how to say the first words of the title, but Wahiwa, Indigenous Pedagogies and Act for Reconciliation and Anti-Racist Education. And Joe Crona has these people's principles of learning in it. And so this, changes how we think about education. So learning ultimately supports the well-being of the self, the family, the community, the land, the spirits, and the ancestors. That'd be lovely. Learning is holistic, reflective, experiential, and relational. Learning involves recognizing the consequences of one's actions. Learning involves generational roles and responsibilities. Learning recognizes the role of Indigenous knowledge. Learning is embedded in memory, history, and story. Learning involves patience and time. Learning requires exploration of one's identity. Speaking to your change in question, Tim. Learning involves recognizing that some knowledge is sacred and only shared with permission and/or in certain situations. How would our education system be different if those were some of the mental models that were creating our structures? So again, you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to come up with the challenges yourself. As soon as you see, oh, this is a structure and this is how I'm contributing, groups like this are great places to find people who are also challenging those. Just some credits at the end. I will put my email in case anybody would like to have a conversation into the chat. And Jenny has posted the feedback link and the link to the book in the chat. So thank you for joining me today. We have 1 minute left. I'm happy to answer questions. I know there's a session starting at 10:30, so thank you though.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Tai. That was, I certainly learned a lot because I was not very familiar with systems thinking. So this was really helpful and appreciated the opportunities to reflect on our own events and patterns. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming. And thank you for participating. It makes such a difference. Thanks for coming, Beatrice. I'm sorry you just came in at the end. And again, I'm happy to chat with anybody. So
It looked fantastic. I'm so sorry I hit the wrong time.
So
I understand. The time differences are a lot.
yeah, thank you. Thank you so
I'm
much.
gonna
Leave now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna stop the recording.